She doesn't belong here. Gideon Voss didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for the entire street to hear, loud enough for the woman standing beside Elias Mercer to feel it land against her chest like a stone. His eyes swept over her veil, over the way she held herself, too still, too careful, and he laughed. Not the laugh of a man who found something funny, but the laugh of a man who wanted everyone watching to know exactly where they stood. "What'd you do, Mercer? Order yourself a broken one because that's all you could afford?" The crowd on the boardwalk went quiet. Maribel did not move. Elias did not speak. And that silence, that terrible stretched-out silence, said everything. If you were her, standing there in front of strangers with your face hidden and your hands trembling, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city or your country in the comments below because I want to see how far this story travels. And if it touches your heart, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now stay with me. This one's worth every minute. The stage was 40 minutes late. Elias Mercer knew this because he had checked his pocket watch 4 times already, standing at the edge of the frozen road with his collar up against a wind that didn't care what day it was or how long a man had been waiting. January in the Montana Territory had a particular kind of cold. Not the cold that bites and retreats, but the kind that settles into a person's bones and makes a home there. He'd lived with that cold for 3 years now. He'd gotten used to it. Most days he barely noticed anymore. He noticed everything today. His hat sat lower on his head than usual. His boots, which Silas had pointed out that morning, were the good ones, not the ranch pair, felt stiff and foreign on his feet. He hadn't shaved as close as he should have. The razor had slipped once, and he'd set it down and decided that was enough. But he'd combed his hair back and worn the dark coat that still smelled faintly of cedar from the chest where it had been folded, untouched for the better part of 2 years. He told himself he wasn't nervous. He was nervous. Silas Rourke had offered to come with him. Elias had told him no. Silas had offered again, leaning against the fence post with that particular expression he wore when he already knew he wasn't going to win an argument, but was going to make his position clear regardless. "You're going to stand there alone like a fence post yourself," Silas had said. "At least let me come so there's someone to talk sense into you." "I don't need sense talked into me," Elias had said. "You need something talked into you," Silas had replied, and left it there. Elias hadn't answered because there wasn't an answer that wouldn't prove the old man right. The truth was that he had not fully decided, even now, standing in the road with ice crusted along the wheel ruts and his breath fogging in front of him, whether he had made a mistake. The letter exchange had taken 3 months. He had been honest in his advertisements, honest about the ranch, about the work, about what he could offer and what he could not. He had not advertised himself as a warm man or a tender man or a man who found conversation easy. He had advertised himself as a working rancher with a house that needed a woman in it and the means to provide decently, and he had received 17 responses. He had written back to 4. He had received 3 replies. And then there was Maribel from Billings, who wrote differently than the others, not performing warmth, not listing her qualities like a merchant listing inventory. She wrote plainly. She said she was 31, that she had been keeping house for her brother's family for 6 years and was prepared for hard work, and that she had one thing to disclose before they went any further, because she believed a man deserved to know what he was agreeing to. She had been in a fire 8 years ago. She had not described it at length. She had written 3 sentences about it, the way a person writes about something they have made peace with carrying but do not particularly want to dwell on. She said her face bore scars on the left side that could not be hidden, and that she understood if this changed his decision. Elias had read that letter 3 times at the kitchen table. Then he had written back and said it did not change his decision. He had not told Silas about the scars. He had not told anyone. And now, standing in the road, he was beginning to understand that there was a gap, a considerable, undeniable gap, between reading about something in a letter and watching a woman step down from a stagecoach in the middle of a frozen Montana street. He heard the stage before he saw it, the bell and the hooves and the driver's voice carrying over the wind. He straightened without thinking about it, fixed his hat, put his watch back in his pocket. The stage pulled in rough, the horses blowing hard, and 2 men climbed down from inside before the door was properly settled. A woman in a dark traveling coat followed, then another, and then there was a pause, a beat too long. and the third woman stepped out wearing a veil. Not a fashion veil. Not the delicate lace thing a woman might wear to keep dust off her face on a long journey. A proper veil, dark and heavy, pinned low over the left side of her face and jaw, falling to her collar. Elias's chest did something complicated. She moved carefully. That was the first thing he noticed. Not slowly but carefully, the way someone moves when they have learned that the world will look regardless, and they have made a private decision about how much of themselves to offer to that looking. She was taller than he'd expected. Her coat was plain, good wool, worn at the elbows. She carried her own bag. She scanned the road and found him. He knew she found him because she stopped moving. He stopped moving too. And then, this was the part he would think about later, lying awake in the dark, he realized his feet had gone to stone. Not because she was frightening, not because she was strange, but because the veil meant that she already knew. She already knew what people saw first. She'd learned it long enough ago that she'd built an entire system around managing it, right down to the pinning of that cloth. He hadn't thought about that part. He'd read the letter and made his decision, and somehow, in all of it, he had not thought about what it cost her to walk into rooms. He walked toward her. He didn't know what his face looked like. He suspected it looked like a man who had just understood something he probably should have understood sooner. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady, steadier than his hands felt inside his coat pockets. "Miss Bell," he said. She was looking at him directly, which he appreciated, and which also made it harder to arrange his face into something that communicated the right things. She had dark eyes. He could see that much through the veil. And she held herself the way a woman holds herself when she has decided in advance that she will not be the first to look away. "I can see your expression," she said. Not unkind, not cruel, just factual, in that quiet, plain-spoken way her letters had been. He said, "I'm sorry, You don't need to apologize for it." She shifted her bag to her other hand. "I'm used to the moment. People need a beat to settle themselves. I've learned to wait it out." He thought that might be the saddest thing he had ever heard said in a calm voice. "I'd like to take your bag," he said, because it was the only thing he was certain was right. She looked at him for another second, searching his face for something. Pity, probably, or the particular expression of a man deciding how to back out gracefully. And then she held the bag out. He took it. "The wagon's this way," he said. She walked beside him. That was how it started. Not with warmth, not with a smile. With a bag changing hands in a frozen road, and two people walking in the same direction because the alternative was worse. The drive out to Mercer Ranch took the better part of an hour, and they did not fill it with much. Elias asked once if she was cold. She said not terribly. He told her the house had a good stove. She said that was good. The horse's hooves on the frozen ground and the creak of the wagon filled the rest. He snuck 2 glances at her, which he was not proud of. She sat straight-backed with her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the landscape moving past, and he could not see her expression because of the veil and the angle. He wondered what she was thinking. He suspected she was wondering whether she'd made a terrible mistake. I was wondering the same thing, but for different reasons than she probably assumed. When the ranch came into view, the main house and the barn and the fences Silas had repaired last fall, Elias watched her look at it. She took it in carefully, the way she did everything, without performance. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "There's a lot of it that needs work," he said. "I want you to know that. I haven't kept it the way it should be kept." She nodded slowly. "How long has it been?" She paused. "How long since someone kept it properly?" 3 years, he said. She didn't ask the follow-up question. He suspected she already knew the shape of the answer. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake and climbed down and came around to offer her a hand. She accepted it briefly, stepped down, and released him as soon as her feet were on the ground. Then she stood and looked at the house. The porch with the railing that needed replacing, the window on the left with the wood patch over a broken pane, the front door that hung slightly wrong on its hinges. And she didn't say anything cutting about it. She didn't perform graciousness either. "I'll need a tour," she said. "Of course." He opened the door and she walked in ahead of him. The kitchen hit him the way it always hit him. The emptiness of it, the particular emptiness of a room that used to be full. The stove was clean because he'd scrubbed it the day before yesterday, embarrassed in advance by what she might think. The table was plain. The curtain rod over the window was bare, the curtains themselves gone 3 years back for reasons he didn't particularly want to discuss. Mara stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned in a slow circle. "It's cold," she said. "The stove hasn't been—" "I'll start it." She was already moving toward it, crouching down to check the firebox. "Where do you keep the wood?" "There's a box on the porch. Silas keeps it filled." She went and got the wood herself. He stood there watching her move through his kitchen with the efficient purpose of a woman who had been keeping houses since she was young, and he felt not ashamed exactly, something adjacent to it, like a man who has let something important go to ruin through the slow accumulation of not caring and has only just been confronted with the evidence. She got the stove going without any fuss. The kitchen began to warm. "I'll need to see the rest," she said, straightening. He showed her the 2 bedrooms, the sitting room, the back storeroom, the washroom. He watched her inventory everything, the gaps, the things missing, the things needing repair, without comment. She asked 2 practical questions: where the well was and whether the pump was reliable in winter. He answered both. They ended back in the kitchen. "Which bedroom is mine?" she asked. He told her the one on the east side. She nodded. Then she reached up and unpinned the veil, folding it in her hands with the practiced motion of someone who has done this thousands of times, and she looked at him directly. The left side of her face, jaw to cheekbone, running up toward the corner of her eye, bore the scarring of a serious burn. The skin was changed there, pulled slightly in places, the color different. It had been there long enough that she carried it like a part of herself, not like an injury, but he understood in that moment why she wore the veil in new places, around strangers. Because people looked. People would always look. He made himself not look away. Not because he was performing decency, but because looking away felt like a small cruelty, and he had enough of those on his conscience already. "I'm not here to beg for anything," she said. Her voice was level. "I'm here to work. I'll keep your house and cook your meals and do what I agreed to do. I'm not asking you to feel things you don't feel. I'm just asking that you treat me like a person." "That's a low bar," he said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out gruffer than he intended. She blinked. "It's been a low bar that not everyone has cleared," she said. He thought about that for a long time after she went to unpack her trunk. He was still thinking about it when Silas came in from the barn at supper time and found the kitchen warm and a pot on the stove that neither of them had put there, and raised an eyebrow at Elias in a way that said a great deal without saying anything. "Seems like she's settling in," Silas said. "She started a fire," Elias said. "I couldn't get the damper right for 40 minutes this morning." Silas looked at the pot on the stove, looked at Elias. "Yep," he said. "Seems like she's settling in." Mara appeared in the doorway. She saw Silas and stopped. "This is Silas Rourke," Elias said. "He runs the ranch with me." "Ma'am," Silas said, hat in hand, his face open and uncomplicated in that way of his that Elias had always appreciated. No shock, no staring. Just a man greeting the lady of the house like it was a perfectly ordinary thing. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "supper's ready in 10 minutes if you're eating with us." "I'll wash up," Silas said, and went back out. Elias watched her go to the stove, and he thought, "She is going to change this house whether I want her to or not." And he did not know yet whether that terrified him or whether he had been waiting for it without knowing it. Probably some of both. Probably the worst kind of both, the kind that sits in the ribs and won't be sorted out easily. She had made a simple stew. He had not eaten a hot meal cooked by someone else in 3 years. He didn't say that to her, but she must have caught something in his face when he sat down, because she paused before setting the bowl in front of him. "Too much salt?" she asked. "No," he said. "No, it's good." She sat across from him. Silas sat at the end. They ate together, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the wind worked at the house the way Montana wind always did, like it had a personal grievance, and none of them said much. But it was not the silence of emptiness. He noticed that. Even that first night he noticed it was a different kind of silence than the one he'd been living inside for 3 years. He couldn't have explained the difference if someone asked him to. He only knew that when he went to bed that night, the house felt less like a monument to something lost, and more like a place where something was still, quietly, happening. Whether that was good or terrible, he did not know yet. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about a woman's voice saying, "It's been a low bar that not everyone has cleared." And he thought about what kind of life a person lives that teaches them to say something like that in a calm tone, as if it's just information, as if it stopped hurting long ago. He thought it probably hadn't stopped hurting. He thought about the way she'd unpinned that veil and looked at him straight on, not flinching, not performing bravery, just standing there and being exactly what she was, waiting to see what he would do with it. He thought he had not done enough. He thought he had not been unkind, but that not being unkind was, as she had put it, a low bar. And then he thought, 3 years. 3 years he had been in this house with nothing alive in it but the fireplace, and Silas coming and going, and the cattle that needed tending, and the cold that never really left. 3 years of keeping himself small enough that grief couldn't find anything to grip. He did not sleep well, but he slept. And in the morning, the stove was already lit when he came into the kitchen, and there was coffee on, and Mara Bell was standing at the window watching the frost on the glass begin to soften as the room warmed, and she turned when she heard him and said, "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," as if this was already the 10th morning and not the 2nd. "Good morning, Miss Bell," he said. And neither of them pretended it wasn't strange, and neither of them pretended it wasn't, in some fragile and uncertain way, a beginning. The first week passed the way first weeks in unfamiliar places always do. In small collisions and careful adjustments, two people learning the geography of each other without a map. Mara woke before Elias every morning. He learned this by the 3rd day, when he came down earlier than usual. The cold had woken him at 4, and he couldn't get back under, and found the kitchen already warm, the coffee pot already going, and Mara at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, making a list of things she needed. She didn't startle when he came in. She just looked up and said, "The washroom needs caulking around the window frame or the whole wall is going to be wet by February," and went back to her list. He stood there for a moment, still half asleep, and said, "Good morning to you too." She looked up again. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape before a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," she said. "The caulking still needs doing." He got himself coffee and sat down across from her and looked at the list she was building. It was methodical, organized by category: kitchen, washroom, bedroom, exterior, and each item was written in a plain, clear hand with no ornamentation. He recognized in that list the same quality he'd found in her letters, a person who communicated what needed communicating and didn't dress it up. "You can call me Elias," he said. She looked at the list. "All right. And I'll call you Mara, if that's acceptable." "That's my name," she said, which was not quite yes and not quite anything else. But he took it for what it was. He told Silas about the caulking that morning. Silas fixed it the same afternoon without comment, which was how Silas handled most things. With a quiet efficiency that Elias had come to rely on so completely he sometimes forgot to be grateful for it. By the end of the first week, Mara had reorganized the kitchen. Not dramatically. She hadn't thrown anything out or moved anything so far that he couldn't find it. But the shelves made sense now in a way they hadn't before. And there was an order to the dry goods and the cast iron that suggested someone who had thought carefully about how a kitchen actually worked rather than how it had always been arranged. She'd also found the box of curtain fabric in the back storeroom, the one Elias had put there and not opened since, and she had stood at the storeroom door holding it and looked at him with a question she didn't ask out loud. "It was my wife's," he said. "Clara. She picked it out, but she didn't get to use it." Mara looked at the fabric for a moment. Then she put it back exactly where she'd found it and closed the storeroom door. He appreciated that more than he knew how to say. What she did instead was find some plain muslin in her own trunk and hang it in the kitchen window, hemmed at the bottom and tied back with a piece of cord. It was not decorative, it was functional. It kept some of the draft off, but it made the window look like a window in a lived-in house rather than a vacancy. And he noticed it the first morning it was there, and felt something shift inside him that he wasn't prepared to name. She didn't ask for praise. She didn't point it out. She was just there, at the stove, stirring something. The problem was that they were strangers in a house built for a life Elias had already lived once. Every room had a history he carried and she couldn't see, and he didn't know how to navigate that without either burying it entirely or drowning them both in it. He said too little most of the time. He knew it. He'd watch her across the supper table and have 17 things he might reasonably say and choose silence instead because silence felt safer than the alternative. Mara seemed to understand this, or at least accept it. She filled the quiet with work rather than chatter, which he found easier to be around than he'd expected. She wasn't performing contentment, she was just occupied. Moving through the house with purpose, always finding the next thing that needed doing, and doing it without waiting to be asked or thanked. But there were moments, small ones. One evening, the 9th night, he counted it later without meaning to, she dropped a bowl. It hit the floor and broke cleanly in two, and she stood looking at it with an expression he couldn't fully read from across the room. And then she crouched down and began picking up the pieces and said, very quietly, more to herself than to him, "That's 2 I owe you." 2? He said. "I cracked the rim of the blue one on Tuesday," she said. "I thought I could hide it, but you'd have found it eventually." He looked at the broken bowl on the floor. It was old. It had a chip on the underside from years before Mara had ever set foot in Montana. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It does to me," she said. He watched her collect the pieces carefully and set them aside rather than throw them away, and he thought, she is someone who has spent a long time waiting to be charged for things. Someone who grew up knowing that everything broken was a debt, and every debt would be called in eventually. He did not know how to tell her that wasn't how he operated without it sounding like a performance. He found the pieces the next morning arranged on the windowsill. She'd fitted them back together like a puzzle and let them dry that way overnight. He understood she wasn't trying to fix what was broken. She just didn't want to pretend it hadn't happened. He left them there for 3 days before he finally put them in the trash, and he didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. 2 weeks in, Silas told Elias that the supply run into Harlan Creek couldn't wait any longer. They needed flour, salt, coffee, wire for the fencing Elias had been putting off, and a handful of other things. Elias said he'd go himself. Silas said maybe Mara would want to come, get her bearings in town, know where things were. Elias said he'd ask her. He found her in the washroom patching one of his work shirts with a piece of cloth she'd cut from somewhere. Not a perfect match, not even close, but strong and well stitched. He asked if she wanted to come to town. She set down the shirt. "Is it far?" "An hour's drive." She was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to see where the dry goods are, yes." He nodded. "Tomorrow morning, then." She went back to the shirt. Then she said without looking up, "Should I wear the veil?" The question caught him somewhere in the chest. He didn't answer immediately, which was probably the wrong thing to do, but he was trying to understand what she was actually asking, whether she was asking his preference or asking whether the town was the kind of place where the veil would protect her. "That's your choice," he said finally. "Not mine." She looked up then, something measured in her eyes. "I know it's my choice," she said. "I was asking whether the town would make it necessary." He thought about Harlan Creek. He thought about the men who gathered in front of the general store on supply days, and the women who stood at the post office window, and the particular way small towns operated when something new and outside their understanding walked into them. He thought about Gideon Voss, whose ranch sat 3 miles north of Elias's property, and who had made a career out of being the largest personality in any room he entered. "Wear what makes you comfortable," he said, which was the coward's answer, and he knew it as soon as he said it. She looked at him for one more second, then went back to the shirt. She wore the veil the next morning. He did not comment on it. They drove to Harlan Creek in the same silence they were still learning to inhabit, and when they arrived on the main street, he helped her down from the wagon and she stood straight-backed on the boardwalk and looked at the town with those dark, measuring eyes. The first person they passed was Martha Henley, who ran the seamstress shop with her daughter. Martha looked at Mara, looked at Elias, and then looked at Mara again in a way that was not hostile but was not warm either, more like inventory being taken, items being counted and recorded. She nodded at Elias and said, "Morning, Elias?" and said nothing to Mara, and went on. Elias felt a flicker of something unpleasant move through him. He said nothing. The dry goods store was run by Pete Aldridge, a man Elias had done business with for 12 years, a decent enough man who had the particular small-town quality of having no malice but also no spine when the social weather required one. Pete looked at Mara carefully when they came in. He asked Elias how the fencing was holding up. He asked Elias if the cattle losses this fall had been bad. He asked Elias, not Mara, whether there was anything else they needed, though Mara was the one holding the list. She handed the list to Pete directly. Pete took it and looked at it and began filling the order, and Elias watched Mara stand in the middle of the store and not wilt, not apologize, just wait with her hands folded and her chin level. He thought, she has done this before. She has stood in rooms where people spoke around her rather than to her, and she has learned to simply occupy the space she's entitled to occupy and wait. He thought, I could say something. He thought, what would I say? He bought the wire and the flour and the coffee and the other things on Mara's list, and they walked back out to the boardwalk, and that was when they encountered Gideon Voss. Gideon was not alone. He was with two other men, Callum Price, who ranched south of town, and a younger man Elias didn't know well. And they were standing in front of the hardware store with that particular posture of men who have nowhere pressing to be and know it. Gideon was tall and heavy through the shoulders, with a jaw built for delivering pronouncements, and he saw Elias from 20 feet away and smiled the way he always smiled, like a man welcoming you into a conversation you hadn't signed up for. Mercer, he said. Gideon, Elias said. He kept walking. Is this the bride then? Gideon said. Not louder than necessary, just exactly loud enough. Elias stopped. He felt rather than saw Mara go still beside him. Not tense, still. The kind of stillness that comes from long practice, from knowing the next 30 seconds requires a particular management of the body and the face. Elias turned. Yes, he said. He kept his voice even. This is my wife. He hadn't called her that before. The word felt large and somewhat foreign in his mouth, and he wasn't entirely sure where it had come from, except that something in Gideon's tone had summoned it. Gideon looked at Mara with the unhurried appraisal of a man who believed his opinions were assets to be shared. He looked at the veil. He looked at the way she stood. He smiled again, and this time there was something in it that made Elias's jaw tighten. Well, Gideon said, I heard you'd ordered yourself a bride. Didn't realize the agency was running discounts on the damaged inventory. He glanced at his companions, who both had the decency to look at their boots, though neither of them said a word. What'd you do, Mercer? Order yourself a broken one because that's all you could afford? The street was not crowded, but there were people. There were always people in Harlan Creek on a supply morning, women running errands, men doing business, the handful of idlers who made the boardwalk their occupation. And every one of them within earshot went quiet in that immediate collective way people go quiet when they're watching something they know they should stop and won't. Elias felt the words land. He felt them land in him, and he felt worse, the way they must have landed in Mara, who was standing one step to his left and who had not moved, had not made a sound, had not given Gideon Voss a single inch of visible reaction. He should have spoken immediately. He didn't. He stood there for what was probably 4 seconds. 4 seconds that felt, he suspected, considerably longer to Mara, with his mouth closed and something working in his chest that was partly rage and partly the old, deeply rutted habit of avoiding a fight with Gideon Voss, who had more money and more allies in this county than Elias had ever cared to match. 4 seconds of silence that said nothing he would have chosen to say. Mara said very quietly and very clearly, "It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Voss," and she turned and walked to the wagon. She did not look back. Elias stood there one more second looking at Gideon Voss, who was watching Mara walk away with that same easy, confident expression, and Elias thought several things very rapidly. He thought about how easy it would be to say nothing, to get in the wagon, to let it be another piece of Harlan Creek ugliness that blew through and settled. He thought about the sound of Mara's voice saying it was a pleasure to meet you, with all the feeling of someone placing a stone on top of something they intended to contain. He thought about 4 seconds of silence. "You're a small man, Gideon," he said. Quiet. Not performing anger, there was no heat in it, which made it land differently than a shout would have. "You've got a lot of money and a big piece of land, and you've spent 30 years making sure everyone in this county knows it. You're still a small man." He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the wagon and climbed up and took the reins, and they drove out of town. For 10 minutes, neither of them said anything. The wagon moved along the frozen road, and the horse's breath came in great white clouds, and the sky was the flat white of a January afternoon that couldn't decide whether to snow. Then Mara said, "You didn't have to say that." "I know I didn't," he said. "He's a powerful man in this county. You've got to live alongside him. I'm aware. She was quiet again. Then, you should have said something sooner. He looked straight ahead at the road. Yes, he said. I should have. She didn't press it. She let it sit between them the way an honest thing sits between two people who are still figuring out whether they can be honest with each other. Present and acknowledged, but not yet fully examined. When they got back to the ranch, Silas came out of the barn and took one look at both of their faces and said nothing at all, which was, as Elias had always thought, one of the man's most underappreciated qualities. That night Mara made a potato soup that was plain and filling and nothing else, and they ate it in the kitchen with the stove throwing heat and the wind doing its work outside. And Elias looked at her across the table and thought about the 4 seconds, and thought about damaged inventory, and thought about the way she'd said it was a pleasure to meet you, like she was sealing a jar. I'm sorry, he said, for not speaking faster. She looked at him. Are you apologizing because you feel bad or because you think I need you to? He considered this seriously. Both, I think, he said, but mostly because it was wrong and I knew it was wrong while I was doing it. She looked at her soup for a moment. I've had worse, she said. That's not much of a standard, he said, and she looked up, and this time it was not the shape before a smile. It was a real one, small and brief and a little startled, as if she hadn't been expecting her own face to do it. No, she said. I suppose it isn't. He held on to that smile for the rest of the evening without understanding why, or rather without being willing to examine why too closely. 3 days later, Elias came home from the north pasture to find a marriage license on the kitchen table. He stood looking at it for a long moment. It was the official document. He'd obtained it before she arrived, had it sitting in the desk drawer because the arrangement required it, but he'd never produced it, and she'd never asked, and somehow the 2 weeks had passed without it being addressed. He picked it up and turned it over and set it back down. Mara was in the doorway. I found it in the desk, she said, when I was looking for the extra candle box. I wasn't hiding it, he said. I know. She came into the kitchen and stood across the table from him. I wasn't accusing you of hiding it. He looked at the document, at the lines for their names, unsigned. We've been operating as if, he started. We've been operating as a working arrangement, she said, which was what we agreed to. Yes. But it's not legally. No, he said. It isn't. She looked at him steadily. He had noticed in 2 weeks of watching her that she had a way of looking at a person that communicated an expectation of honesty. Not demanding, not aggressive, just clear. Clear in the way some people are clear, where you know they will accept the truth, but they will know immediately if they're being given something else. I'd like to sign it, he said, if you're willing. She didn't say anything right away. He watched something move through her expression. Not suspicion, not relief, something more complicated than either. The look of a person doing a rapid and private accounting of risk. Why? She said. He hadn't expected that question. He thought about it. Because what happened in town was wrong, he said. And because you work harder than anyone I've had in this house. And because if Gideon Voss or anyone else in this county has something to say about you, I want there to be no question about where you stand. She looked at the license. That's a practical answer, she said. I'm a practical man. Are you? She looked up at him with something in her eyes he couldn't quite interpret. Or is it easier to call it practical? He didn't have a good answer to that, so he said nothing, which he was beginning to understand she also received as information. She reached out and picked up the pen from the side of the table. She signed her name in the same plain, clear hand she used for her lists. Then she put the pen down and pushed the document toward him. He signed beside her name. It didn't feel like a ceremony. It felt like two people standing at a fork in a road and choosing the same direction without quite being sure what was ahead. It felt uncertain and deliberate in equal measure, which he suspected was probably the only honest way for something like this to feel. All right, she said. All right, he said. She went back to whatever she'd been doing before. He folded the license and put it in the desk, in a different drawer from where it had been, one he actually opened sometimes. The blizzard came 9 days later. It gave no particular warning, or rather, it gave the warning that anyone who had lived in Montana Territory for more than 2 winters would have recognized in the quality of the afternoon light and the behavior of the horses and the smell of the air. But Elias had not been paying attention to those things the way he usually did, distracted by the fencing that still needed mending in the south pasture and a slow leak Silas had discovered in the roof of the smaller barn. By the time he recognized it, they had about an hour. He got the cattle into the barn. Silas battened down what could be battened. Mara, without being asked, went through the house and filled every available container with water, then brought in extra wood from the porch until the stack inside was higher than her shoulder. "How bad?" she asked, when the first real gusts hit. 3 days, maybe, he said. Maybe more. She looked at the stack of wood she'd built. Then she went and got more. The snow came in hard from the northwest, the kind that doesn't fall so much as drive horizontally and find its way into every gap and cranny, and within 2 hours the world outside the windows was pure white noise. Silas was in the bunkhouse, close enough to be fine, far enough that he wasn't coming out until it broke. Elias and Mara were alone in the house with the stove going full and the wind making the walls sound like they were being worked on from outside. The first day they were polite to each other. He read. She mended. They had supper and said practical things about the storm and the firewood supply. The second day the politeness wore thinner, the way it always does when you can't put distance between yourself and another person. Not hostile, just present, more present than they'd been yet. I was checking the window seals against drafts when she said, from across the room, "What was she like?" He didn't turn around. "Who?" "Your wife," Mara said. "Clara." He stood at the window with his hand against the frame and felt the cold seeping in from the glass. He had not talked about Clara to anyone except Silas, and even to Silas only occasionally, in the practical way men sometimes talked about loss, obliquely, briefly, moving on quickly. She was stubborn, he said, about certain things. She had opinions about how a fire should be laid that she would defend past all reason. He paused. She was kind, though, genuinely kind. Not polite, kind. There's a difference. There is, Mara said quietly. She died in the second winter, he said. Fever. Came fast. Stopped. He turned from the window. I couldn't get the doctor here in time. Mara was looking at him with the particular attention of someone who is listening to the whole thing, not just the words. I'm sorry, she said. It was 3 years ago, he said. I know when it was, she said. I'm still sorry. He sat down. Not near her, not across the room from her. Somewhere in the middle, in the chair by the second window. What about you? He said. The fire. How old were you? She set down the mending she'd been working on. She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment, the way someone looks when they're deciding how much of a thing to give. 23, she said. I was keeping house for a family in Billings, the Garretts. Good people. Their chimney flue had been wrong for years, and everyone knew it, and no one fixed it. She was quiet for a beat. The youngest child was 2. I got her out. He looked at her. I didn't get myself out as cleanly, she said, with a tone that was almost dry, almost wry, and he understood it was the armor she'd built around the story. The slight humor, the understatement, the way of telling it that kept the worst of it at arm's length. Were you with anyone, he said, before coming here? No. She picked up the mending again. There were 2 men who expressed interest after the fire. Both of them. She paused. Let's say they were interested in the idea until they saw the reality, and then they were interested in something else. He felt the familiar anger from the street in Harlan Creek move through him again, but quieter this time, slower. I spent 5 years telling myself it was fine, she said, that I didn't need, but that I was suited to keeping house for others, and that was enough. My brother was grateful to have me. His children were fond of me. It was... She stopped again. It was a life that belonged mostly to other people. He didn't say anything. He just listened. That's why I answered your advertisement, she said. Not because I had romantic notions about it, because I wanted something that was mine, even if it was hard, even if the man I married spent most of his time in silence and the house needed every inch of it repaired. She glanced at him with that almost smile. No offense. Some taken, he said. The house isn't that bad. The window in the washroom lets in enough cold air to cure a ham. I had Silas fix the caulking, after I told you about it. That's how things get fixed, he said. Someone tells you they need fixing. She looked at him. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not like a door opening or a light turning on. More like the subtle shift of pressure when a window's been cracked in a closed room, a change you feel before you can explain it. I suppose that's true, she said. They talked through most of that second night, which neither of them planned and neither of them commented on directly. They talked about small things and then larger things, the way people do when the storm is big enough and the house is small enough, and there's nothing else to do but be present to each other. He told her about the ranch before Claire's death, when it had been a real working operation with more hands and better fencing. She told him about the Garrett children and a particular goat she'd once had to chase through 3 blocks of Billings. He laughed at that, really laughed, not the polite variety, and she looked at him like she was recalibrating something. "You have a good laugh," she said. "I wasn't expecting that." "What were you expecting?" "I don't know." She thought about it. "More brooding, I suppose." "I can brood if you'd prefer." "Please don't." The third day of the blizzard, the storm broke its back sometime in the afternoon, and the wind dropped to something almost human. They spent it in a comfortable quiet that was different from the careful quiet of the first 2 weeks. Not the quiet of 2 people avoiding contact, but the quiet of 2 people who have recently said enough honest things to each other that silence no longer feels dangerous. Silas appeared at supper time, snow-caked and squinting, and ate with them and looked between them with a careful, unsaying expression. After supper, he told Elias the south fence had probably come down in at least 2 places and they'd need to check it at first light. Then he went back to the bunkhouse. In the kitchen, washing up, Mara said, "He notices everything, doesn't he?" "Silas?" "Yes." Does he say much to you about," she gestured vaguely, which he understood to mean, "about all of this?" "He says what needs saying," Elias said. "No more." She nodded. She was drying a bowl, turning it in her hands the way she turned things sometimes when she was thinking. "He was kind to me," she said, "from the first day. He didn't make a thing of it. That's Silas." "It matters," she said. "When someone just doesn't make a thing of it. It's not a small thing, even though it looks like one." He thought about that. He thought about the moments he had and hadn't made a thing of something, and which ones she remembered. He suspected she kept a careful internal record of both. "I know," he said. She put the bowl down on the shelf. She looked at him, and in the kitchen light with the stove's warmth filling the room and 3 days of blizzard finally behind them, her face was... He didn't look away from it. He'd been practicing not looking away since the first day, and by now it was no longer practice. It was just what he did. The scarring was part of her face the way all of her face was part of her, and her face was... He stopped the thought before it went somewhere he wasn't sure he had the right to take it yet. "Well," she said. "Good night, Elias." "Good night, Mara." She went to her room. He stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the warmth she'd built into the room. The curtain she'd hung, the shelf she'd reorganized, the particular smell of the soup she'd kept on the back of the stove. The way the house held its warmth differently now, as if it had learned how again. He thought, "I don't know what this is becoming." He thought, "I think I might need to find out." Outside, the snow was deep and clean, and the sky had cracked open above it, full of cold and clear, and the kind of darkness that pressed stars out of itself by sheer density. And somewhere in the south pasture, the fencing had come down in 2 places, and there was a great deal of work to do in the morning. But the house was warm. The house was, against all expectation and 3 years of evidence to the contrary, warm. And Elias Mercer stood in his kitchen and let himself feel it, just for a moment before he went to bed. Spring came to Mercer Ranch the way it always came to Montana. Not gently, not with any particular ceremony, but with a kind of stubborn insistence that eventually wore the cold down. The snow retreated by inches rather than miles, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, then the flat ground around the barn, then finally the deep drifts against the north side of the house that had been there since the blizzard. The mud came next, the particular deep, boot-swallowing mud of a Montana spring thaw that made every trip between the house and the barn an exercise in commitment. And then, one morning in late March, Elias walked outside and the air smelled different. Not cold anymore, not the flat iron smell of winter, but something alive underneath it, something that had been waiting. Mara was already on the porch when he came out. She had her coffee, and she was looking out at the south pasture where the first thin green was showing through the brown. And she had an expression on her face he hadn't seen before, unguarded, quiet, something close to wonder, though she would probably have objected to that word if he'd used it. "There's a patch by the fence post," she said, without looking at him. "Third one from the barn. Something's coming up there. I don't know what it is." "Could be anything," he said. "Claire used to plant bulbs along there. I don't remember what kind." Mara looked at the fence post. "Well," she said, "we'll see." That was the thing about spring at Mercer Ranch that year. It kept producing things that had been buried, not just the bulbs along the south fence, which turned out to be a straggled row of purple crocuses that came up crooked and gap-toothed from years of neglect, but came up regardless. The pasture grass grew back thicker than it had been the year before because Elias had finally gotten the drainage right on the low corner. The apple tree behind the house, which Silas had been calling dead for 2 years, put out a tentative scattering of blossoms on its east-facing branches, as if it was trying the idea cautiously before committing to it. And the two people inside the ranch house were growing towards something too, in that same cautious, tentative way, putting out small branches of trust and seeing whether they held. It wasn't linear. Nothing about it was. There were days when the old distance reasserted itself, when Elias went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with Mara and everything to do with something inside him that hadn't finished healing, and she'd give him room for it without asking questions, which he appreciated and also sometimes resented in a way he couldn't fully justify. There were mornings when she was short with him over small things, the way he left the barn door unlatched, the way he tracked mud into the kitchen after she'd just swept it, with a sharpness that had less to do with the door or the mud and more to do with the accumulated weight of adjusting to a life that still didn't feel entirely hers. They were not always kind to each other. They were not always patient. They were two people sharing close quarters and deep uncertainty, and it showed sometimes. But they kept going. That was the thing. Every morning they were both there, at the table, in the kitchen, walking the same ground, and that continuity built something between them that couldn't have been built any other way. In early April, Elias came home from town with a length of fabric tucked under his arm. He set it on the kitchen table without announcement and stepped back like a man who wasn't sure whether he'd done something right. Mara was at the stove. She turned and looked at it. She looked at him. The fabric was blue, a deep, honest blue, not flashy, the color of late afternoon sky in October. And it was good quality, better than she would have bought for herself. "What's this?" she said. "Fabric," he said. She gave him a look that communicated, with great efficiency, that she was aware of what it was. "For a dress," he said. "Or whatever you need. I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "You've been wearing the same 3 things since January. The gray dress has a tear at the shoulder that you've mended twice. I noticed." She looked at the fabric for a moment. He couldn't read her expression from across the kitchen, which happened sometimes. Her face went private in a way that reminded him she'd spent years learning to keep her interior weather from public view. Then she crossed the room and touched the edge of the fabric with 2 fingers, feeling the weight of it. "It's good cloth," she said. "I asked Pete Aldridge what was worth buying," he said. "He showed me 3 things, and I picked the one I liked best." She looked up. "You picked it." "I have eyes," he said, a little defensively. "I know what blue looks like." The almost smile came, and this time it stayed a little longer than usual. "Thank you," she said. Not elaborately, not with performance, just clean and direct, the way she did everything. "You're welcome," he said, and went to change out of his town boots. She started cutting the fabric 2 days later, spreading it on the kitchen table in the evenings after supper with a paper pattern she'd made herself, marking it with chalk, moving around it with a focus that excluded everything else in the room. He'd come in for his evening coffee, and she'd be bent over the table with her tongue between her teeth and her chalk moving in small, precise arcs. And he'd get his coffee and sit and watch, and she'd either not notice or pretend not to, either of which was fine by him. It was the garden that came next. Mara had been looking at the plot behind the house, the weedy, half-collapsed remnant of what had clearly once been a proper kitchen garden, since the snow had come off it in March. He'd caught her standing at the back window more than once, looking at it with that particular expression she got when she was planning something. When she finally said one morning, "I want to work that garden plot," It had the quality of a decision she'd already made and was informing him of, rather than a request. "That's a lot of work," he said. "I'm aware of that," she said. "The soil's going to need—" "I know what the soil needs," she said. "Do you have a spade?" He had 2 spades. He got them out of the barn and brought them to the back of the house and found her already there in her work dress and old boots, crouching down and pulling at a dried thistle root with her bare hands, examining what came up with the focus of a woman conducting an investigation. "You don't have to do this today," he said. "I want to do it today," she said. "The ground's soft enough." He stood there for a moment, holding both spades. He had a fence line to check and a water trough that was leaking in the north pasture. He had a full day's worth of work that had nothing to do with the garden. He handed her 1 spade and kept the other. They worked the garden plot for most of that morning, turning the soil and pulling the deep-rooted weeds and breaking up the crusted patches where the drainage was poor. It was hard physical work, not romantic. Their backs ached. There were worms. At one point, Mara drove her spade into what turned out to be an old fence post buried just below the surface, and the handle cracked back and hit her wrist hard enough to leave a mark. She said a word he hadn't heard from her before, and then looked up and found him looking at her and said, without any particular embarrassment, "I learned that from my brother." "Is it accurate?" he said, looking at the buried post. "Extremely," she said. He got a longer bar from the barn, and they spent 20 minutes working the post out of the ground together, him levering, her clearing the dirt from around it with her hands. And when it finally came free, they both staggered slightly, and then stood looking at it. This rotten, 6-year buried post that had no business still being so difficult, and he started laughing first. Then she did. Not politely, not performatively, but the real kind, the surprised kind, the kind that takes you because you weren't braced for it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that in this yard. He thought about that while he was checking the north pasture trough in the afternoon. About laughter, specifically, and about the difference between the sound of a house that had people in it and a house that merely had a person in it. He'd been a person in a house for 3 years. He knew what that sounded like. It sounded like nothing, mostly, like a clock ticking in an empty room. When he got back to the house that evening, Mara was on the porch. She was sitting on the step rather than in the chair, which she didn't usually do, and she was looking out at the line of the south fence where the crocuses had come up. She had taken the veil off hours ago. She'd stopped wearing it around the ranch property by the end of February, just put it on for town, and he'd learned not to mark the difference one way or the other because she didn't want it marked. And her face was in profile against the evening light, the scarred left side facing him as he came up from the pasture. He sat down on the porch step beside her, not at a careful, polite distance, beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She didn't move away. "The crocuses are going to finish in another week," she said. "There'll be something else," he said. "Clara used to say the south fence bloomed in succession all the way to August." Mara looked at the fence. "What came after the crocuses?" "I don't know," he said. "I never paid that much attention." He paused. "I regret that now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned back slightly. He felt rather than saw it, and her shoulders settled against his arm. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. He stayed very still, the way you stay still when something fragile has landed near you and you don't want to be the thing that disturbs it. They sat like that while the sun went down behind the hills. He was aware, acutely and uncomfortably aware, of how long it had been since he'd been this close to another person and wanted to stay there. It made something tighten in him, not against Mara, nothing against Mara, but against the awareness itself, against what it meant. Because wanting to stay was the beginning of something he knew the cost of. He'd paid that cost before. He knew exactly how expensive it was to let someone become necessary to you, knew it in the bones-deep, permanent way that only one kind of experience teaches. He was thinking about all of this, sitting very still on the porch step with her shoulder warm against his arm, when she said, "You went somewhere." He came back. "Sorry?" "You were here and then you weren't," she said. Matter of fact, not accusatory. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" He looked at the fence line. The last light was going pink at the horizon. "About whether I'm—" He stopped, tried again. "I've been careful for a long time," he said. "Careful feels safe. It's not always—" I'm aware it's not always the right thing. She looked at him. He could feel it without turning his head. Careful about what specifically? She said. He turned his head. She was close. Closer than he'd registered somehow, sitting here on this narrow porch step. And her dark eyes were doing the thing they did, the seen-through thing, the thing that made it difficult to answer with anything except the truth. He reached out, slowly, no sudden movement, giving her every opportunity to move, and touched the side of her face, the scarred side. With 2 fingers, light as anything, against the changed skin of her jaw, she went completely still, not flinching, still. Her eyes didn't leave his. I'm careful about this, he said. Very quiet. Her breath came out slowly. He watched something happen in her expression, something working, something being weighed and considered and felt all at once, and it was the most unguarded he'd ever seen her face, the most present she'd ever let herself be in front of him. He leaned toward her slightly, and she didn't pull back, and for one suspended moment there was almost… And then he stopped. He pulled his hand back. He turned his head away, back to the fence line, back to the ordinary safe geography of the south pasture in the evening light. He felt her stillness beside him change quality. Not dramatically. She didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. But something settled in her that hadn't been settled a moment ago, something closing down that had briefly been open. He had done it again. The same thing as in the street in Harlan Creek. He had reached the edge of something, and instead of stepping forward, he had stepped back, and she had noticed every fraction of a second of it. I should start supper, she said. Her voice was perfectly even. Mara, it's getting dark, she said, and stood up and went inside. He sat on the porch step alone and looked at the south fence until the last of the light was gone, feeling like a man who has had something in his hands and through a failure of nerve he can't even properly explain, has let it fall. Inside, supper was made and supper was eaten, and they were civil to each other. Not cold, not hostile, just careful in a way that had a different texture than the careful of the early weeks. This careful had an edge to it, an awareness. He slept badly. He lay in the dark and thought about Clara. Not about her death, not tonight, but about the way her absence had reorganized him, slowly and without his full awareness, into a man whose primary relationship was with the fact of loss. A man who had learned to keep himself at the precise distance from everything where nothing could hurt him, because nothing could reach him. It was a very efficient system. It was also, he was beginning to understand with a clarity he couldn't attribute to anything except the look on Mara's face when he'd pulled away, a very slow and quiet form of waste. She did not mention the porch the next morning, nor the morning after. Neither did he. The garden work continued. The blue dress took shape on the kitchen table in the evenings. The garden plot got turned and sectioned off, and Mara had Silas drive her to town one afternoon when Elias was working the far pasture, and she came back with seeds and a packet of notes she'd written from memory about planting schedules and spacing, which she tacked up inside the back door with a level of organization that told him she'd been planning this for weeks. May came in warm and they put the seeds in. Not together this time. She had her system and her notes, and she didn't need him underfoot, which he respected, and there was plenty of other work needing doing. But he came by in the afternoon to see how it was going, and she was on her knees in the dirt showing no concern whatsoever for the state of her skirt, and she looked up when he cast a shadow over her and said, "The beans are going in the wrong place." "I didn't put any beans anywhere," he said. "I'm pre-arguing with myself about it," she said. "The south end gets more sun. They should go there. But I put the squash there." "Move the squash. I already pressed those seeds in." "Mara." "What?" "Move the squash." She looked at the garden bed. She looked at him. Then she started carefully excavating the squash seeds she'd just put down, moving them 6 feet south with the painstaking care of a woman who refused to let a repositioned seed be a failure. He crouched down and helped without being asked, and they worked alongside each other in the dirt in the late afternoon with the birds going about their business overhead. And it was ordinary, and it was not ordinary at all. Gideon Voss appeared on a Thursday, the second week of May. Elias was out in the north pasture when it happened. He didn't know about it until that evening, until supper was on the table and Mara sat down and there was something different about the set of her shoulders, something held in and too deliberate, and he looked at her and knew immediately that something had happened. "What is it?" he said. She picked up her fork. Gideon Voss came by the ranch today. The words hit him like cold water. He set down his fork. He came here? To the ranch? He knocked on the front door, she said. I answered it. Elias looked at her face. She was keeping it carefully neutral, which told him more than an open expression would have. What did he want? She took a breath, set down her own fork. He offered me money, she said, $500, to leave. The kitchen went very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. He said, she paused, and he could see her deciding how much to give him. He said you were a proud man, that you'd made a mistake but were too stubborn to correct it, that you deserved a woman who could be a proper wife to you in every capacity, that he was doing both of us a kindness. Elias was aware of his hands flat on the table. He was aware of his jaw. He was holding himself very still because what was moving through him was the kind of thing that, if he let it get ahead of him, would result in choices he'd have to live with. What did you say to him? He said. I said no, she said simply. I told him to get off your property. He left? He left, she said. But before he did, she looked at the table. He said you'd never told me what you really thought because you were too decent to say it to my face. He said the whole county knew you'd made a mistake. He said that you were ashamed and that any man would be, and that I was doing you no favors by staying where I wasn't. She stopped. Mara. Where I wasn't wanted, she said. Very quiet. He looked at her. That's not true, he said. She looked up. And here was the thing. Here was the thing he hadn't anticipated, the thing that landed harder than Gideon's words or the $500 offer or any of it. He could see that she wasn't sure. He could see that she had heard Gideon Voss standing at the door of her house and saying the words she was already afraid were true. And some part of her, the part that had been trained by 8 years of people's stares and 2 men who had changed their minds and a lifetime of being managed out of rooms. Some part of her had filed it alongside all the evidence she'd been collecting. Is it? She said. He heard in her voice not accusation, but something more frightening than accusation. The genuine asking of a woman who was trying to figure out what was real, who had been trying to figure it out since January, doing the patient work of determining whether this place, this man, this life, was actually hers or whether she was just passing through it. And Elias sat there with all of that in her eyes, and he felt the answer sitting in his chest, clear and warm and entirely certain, the clearest thing he'd felt in 3 years. And he opened his mouth. And what came out was, it's complicated. The moment the words landed, he wanted to pull them back. It's complicated. 2 of the smallest, most gutless words in the English language, and he had deployed them at the precise moment she most needed him not to. She looked at him for a long time. Her face did the closing down thing, the private weather thing, the face she wore when she was managing how much of herself to show. She picked up her fork. All right, Mara, I didn't mean, you don't have to explain it, she said, steady, even. I asked a question and you answered it. That's an answer too. It's not what Please, she said. Let's just eat. He ate. He didn't taste any of it. He watched her across the table eat her supper with the careful attention of a woman who was doing something precise with her composure, building something internal. He recognized as the same structure he'd been maintaining for 3 years, the architecture of someone who has decided, quietly and without announcement, to stop expecting. He knew that architecture intimately. He'd built it himself. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark and listened to the house, and knew from the particular silence coming from her room that she wasn't sleeping either, or had been, and had stopped, one or the other. He thought about the porch step. He thought about his hand against her face, and the moment before he'd pulled back. He thought about, it's complicated, and wanted to put his fist through something. He thought about Gideon Voss coming to this ranch, this house. The house where Mara had hung a curtain in the kitchen window and built a garden from weeds and arranged the shelves so everything made sense, and standing at the door and saying, "You're not wanted," with the casual confidence of a man who had never in his life been made to feel he wasn't wanted anywhere. He thought about Mara saying, "I told him to get off your property." Not our property, your property, even now, even after 4 months. She still didn't fully believe it was hers. He had not done enough to make her believe it. He had been careful and deliberate, and he had told himself that was decency, that was respect, that was giving her space. And underneath all of it was the simple cowardice of a man who was more afraid of loving someone than of losing them. I understood this clearly at 3 in the morning, in the dark of the Montana spring, lying in the bed 3 rooms away from the woman who had come to his house in January and made it into something worth living in. He understood it completely and with a specific burning clarity that was the opposite of comfortable. He also understood something else. He understood that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, she was going to be gone. He didn't know when exactly. But the calculation had started in her eyes at the supper table when he'd said, "It's complicated," and it was going to run its course, and she was going to reach the answer she'd been trying to avoid reaching ever since Gideon Voss had named her fear out loud. And when she reached it, she would go. Quietly and thoroughly, the way she did everything. And she would take with her the curtain and the garden plan, and the blue dress half finished on the table, and the sound of a real laugh in the yard on a spring morning, and the house would go back to what it had been. He lay in the dark knowing all of this, and also knowing, and this was the part that cost him something, that knowing it was not enough. Knowing the right thing was not the same as doing it. He'd known the right thing on the porch step, and he'd pulled his hand back. He'd known the right thing in the street in Harlan Creek, and he'd been 4 seconds too slow. A man could know things indefinitely, lying in the dark, and still walk out in the morning and reach for it's complicated because it was available and the alternative was terrifying. He was still awake when the first gray came into the window. He heard her moving in her room. Earlier than usual, it wasn't yet 5. He heard the soft sounds of a trunk being opened, and items being placed, and the particular care of movement that a person makes when they are trying not to be heard. He lay in his bed and heard her packing. He lay there for a long time, long enough that the light in the window went from gray to the particular pale gold of very early morning, and the birds started outside, and the packing sounds in the next room continued with a patient, methodical thoroughness that was entirely, recognizably, heartbreakingly Mara. Then he got up. He didn't take time to think about it. He got up and he went to the kitchen and he put the coffee on and he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden, her garden, the turned earth and the pressed-in seeds, and the squash that she'd moved 6 feet south so the beans would have more sun. And he stood there until the coffee was ready and the first real light was coming over the hills. And on the kitchen table, next to the folded length of blue fabric and the half-finished dress, was a note. He picked it up. Her handwriting, plain and clear. It said, "I'm sorry I wasn't what you needed. It deserves to. M." He set the note down. He put his hand flat on the blue fabric. He stood there in the warming kitchen of the house she had changed out of all recognition from the cold, empty thing it had been in January, and he felt the full weight of what he was about to lose, pressing down on him like the blizzard had pressed down on the roof. Not dramatically, not with a crash, just relentlessly, from all sides at once, until something either held or gave. He heard her door open. He heard her footsteps in the hall. He heard them stop at the kitchen doorway. He did not turn around yet. He stood with his hand on the blue fabric and he said, "To the window and the garden and the early morning light, don't go." She was standing in the kitchen doorway with her trunk bag over her shoulder and her coat already buttoned and her hat in her hand, and she looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at his hand flat on the blue fabric, and she did not move. "Don't go," he said again, still facing the window, still not turning around. The kitchen held its breath. "Elias," she said, and her voice was the careful, managed voice she used when she was keeping something large and difficult from getting out of hand. "I think it's better if—" "I'm not asking you because I'm supposed to," he said. He turned around then. He looked like a man who had not slept and knew it showed and had decided not to care. "I'm not asking because it's the right thing or the decent thing or because I feel obligated. I'm asking because the idea of you walking out of this house is the worst thing I've thought about in 3 years, and I've thought about some genuinely terrible things." She looked at him. Her hand was tight around the brim of her hat. "You said it was complicated." "I know what I said." "That's an answer, Elias. That's not nothing." "It was a coward's answer," he said. "I knew it the second it came out of my mouth. I've been lying here all night knowing it." He moved from the window, not toward her, just away from the window, as if he needed to occupy different ground. "I'm not good at this. I need you to know that before anything else. I spent 3 years making sure nothing could get close enough to matter, and I was very good at it, and then you came and you made it." He stopped, put his hand on the back of a kitchen chair. You made it impossible to maintain. She hadn't moved from the doorway. Her expression was doing the thing, the private weather thing, but there were cracks in it now, places where the management wasn't quite holding. Gideon Voss told you I was ashamed of you, he said. I want to be clear about something. I am not ashamed of you. I have never once, in any moment of any day since January, been ashamed of you. He looked at her directly, the way she'd taught him without meaning to. Straight on, no looking away. I'm ashamed of how long it took me to say that plainly. That's a different thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, What are you afraid of? He let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest for about 12 hours. Losing someone again, he said. Specifically, losing someone I love again. Because I've done it once, and I know exactly what it costs, and I'm a grown man who understands what he's risking when he lets someone matter that much. He paused. That's not complicated, that's just fear. I dressed it up as complicated because it sounded better. The word, love, sat in the kitchen between them. He had not planned to use it. It had come out because it was accurate, and somewhere in the long dark hours of the night, he had made a private and exhausted decision to stop editing himself towards safety and just say the true thing. Mara looked at him for a long moment. The hat in her hand turned once, her fingers working the brim in a slow, unconscious circle. She looked at the kitchen, at the curtain she'd hung, the shelves she'd reorganized, the note she'd left on the table next to the blue fabric. Then she looked back at him. I hurt, she said, when you pulled away on the porch. And then last night when you said, she stopped. I've been managing my expectations of people for a very long time, Elias. I'm good at it. I know how to adjust and recalibrate and tell myself it's fine. I did it this morning. I packed my trunk and I told myself it was fine. Her voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now, something that was working hard to stay contained. But it wasn't fine, and I don't want to keep doing that. You shouldn't have to, he said. No, she said. I shouldn't. She looked at him steadily. But wanting you to be different and you actually being different are two separate things. I don't know which one this is yet. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm just asking you to stay long enough to let me show you which one it is. She stood in the doorway. She looked at the bag on her shoulder and at the note on the table and at him. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window now, the real early summer light, laying itself across the floor and the table and the blue fabric. She put the bag down. Not a declaration, not a ceremony, just a bag set down on the kitchen floor, and a woman standing a little straighter, and a man who let out a breath so slowly that it barely made a sound. I'll need coffee, she said. It's already on, he said. She came into the kitchen. She sat down at the table, not across from him, but beside her note, which she picked up and folded and put in her apron pocket without discussion. He got 2 cups and poured the coffee and set one in front of her, and sat across from her, and they looked at each other over the cups in the early morning light. This is going to be difficult, she said. Yes, he said. You're going to have to actually say things, when you're feeling them, not 3 hours later. I understand. I mean it, she said. Not as a condition, I can work with a lot of things. I cannot work with silence that I'm supposed to interpret correctly. That's fair, he said. He wrapped his hands around his cup. I'm going to be bad at it at first. I know, she said, and there was something almost gentle in it. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for the attempt. They drank their coffee in the early quiet of a May morning, and outside the garden was there with its pressed-in seeds and its moved squash and its crocus roots along the south fence that were already done blooming but had left their stalks behind as evidence they'd been there at all. And the house was warm and imperfect and theirs, and neither of them said anything more for a few minutes, because there wasn't anything more that needed saying just yet. Silas appeared at the kitchen door at 6:30 in the way he always appeared. Not knocking, not barging, just materializing in the frame with his hat on and his eyes that saw everything and processed it into a face that showed nothing he didn't want to show. He looked at Elias. He looked at Mara. He looked at the bag on the kitchen floor and the 2 coffee cups on the table. Morning, he said. Morning, Silas, Mara said. There's coffee. Don't mind if I do, he said, and helped himself, and sat at the end of the table and said nothing about the bag or the note or the look on either of their faces. He drank his coffee and said the south fence still needed one more repair from the thaw damage, and asked Elias when he wanted to get to it. "This afternoon," Elias said. "Works for me," Silas said, and finished his coffee and went back to the barn. 3 days passed, and they did not talk about the morning with the packed trunk again, not directly. What they did instead was exist in the same house with slightly more honesty than before. Small adjustments, the kind that are invisible unless you're looking for them. He told her when the fence repair took longer than expected and he'd be home late, rather than just arriving late. She told him when she was frustrated, twice, instead of managing it inward until it came out sideways about something else. They were practicing. It was not smooth. It was recognizably the work of two people trying to do better, which is a different and less elegant thing than doing it naturally. On the fourth evening, he came in from the south pasture to find her at the kitchen table with the blue fabric and the half-finished dress, sewing by the last of the window light. He sat down across from her and watched her hands move. Precise, efficient, the needle making small, even stitches that would hold whatever they were holding indefinitely. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can try," she said, not looking up. "The fire," he said. "The family you got out, the Garretts. Did you ever go back? Afterward?" She paused with the needle mid-pull. She looked up. "Once," she said. "About a year after. I wanted to see if... I don't know what I wanted to see." She looked at the fabric. "The little girl didn't remember me. She was 2 when it happened. She was 3 when I visited. She didn't know me from anyone." She made another stitch. Mrs. Garrett cried. She held my face in her hands and cried. And I didn't know what to do with that because I'd spent a year learning not to need it. And then there it was. "Did it help?" he said. "Going back?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. "It helped me understand that I'd been waiting for something to feel like enough," she said. "And it never quite does. You just have to decide to keep going anyway." He nodded slowly. "Why are you asking?" she said. "Because I think I've been waiting for something too," he said. "For some point where it felt safe enough to stop being careful. And I'm starting to think that point isn't coming, that you just have to decide." She looked at him over the fabric. "That's accurate," she said. "Is it also terrifying?" "Extremely," she said, and went back to her sewing. The summer moved through June in the particular lush way that Montana summers move when you've been paying attention, the garden growing with a productivity that justified every seed decision and every repositioned squash. The beans Mara had given prime sun to grew into something that made Silas stop at the fence of the garden plot one morning and say, with what for him was considerable enthusiasm, "Those are some beans." She had gone back to town twice on her own, without Elias, driving the smaller wagon herself, which he had offered to accompany her for the first trip, and she had declined, and he had respected the decline, and she had come back both times with what she needed and without incident, or at least without the kind of incident she told him about. He suspected there were smaller incidents. There always were in Harlan Creek. He did not ask because she had not offered, and he was learning, slowly, with some backsliding, the difference between checking in and hovering. What he did do, the second time she came back from town, was come out to the yard when he heard the wagon and take the reins while she climbed down and take the parcels from the back without making it a production. And she looked at him with a slightly surprised expression, as if she'd been prepared to do it herself and hadn't expected the assistance, and then she handed him the parcels and said, "There's coffee flour in the paper parcel. Don't squeeze it." "I know what flour feels like," he said. "You squeezed the last bag," she said. "Once," he said. "Once was enough," she said, and went inside, and he carried the parcels in and did not squeeze the flour and felt, for reasons that he would not have been able to fully articulate to another person, like something was going in the right direction. It was Silas who forced the conversation that had been waiting to happen. It happened on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of June, at the end of a long day working the far pasture. They were walking back toward the barn, both of them dirty and tired in the satisfying way of genuine physical work, and Silas said without preamble, "You're still holding back." Elias looked at him. "With Mara," Silas said. "You've been better, you have, but you're still holding something in reserve, and she can tell." "She said something to you?" "She doesn't have to say things," Silas said. "She's like me that way. You can see it in how she moves around you. She's still not sure of her footing." He looked ahead at the barn. which means you haven't given her reason to be sure yet. Not all the way. I'm working on it, Elias said. I know you are, Silas said. I'm not criticizing the working. I'm telling you the working isn't finished. He paused. You know what you need to do, and you're still finding reasons not to do it all the way. It's not that simple. I know it's not simple, Silas said. Simple and necessary aren't the same thing. He stopped walking, turned to face Elias with the full, patient attention of a man who had known Elias for 15 years and had earned the right to say difficult things. Claire's been gone 3 years. You know that. You know what she'd think about you doing this to yourself. He held up a hand before Elias could respond. I'm not telling you to forget her. I'm telling you that she's not the reason you're afraid. You're the reason you're afraid. And there's a difference, and you need to figure out what you're going to do with it. He walked on to the barn and left Elias standing in the pasture with his hands at his sides and the late afternoon light on his back and the particular quality of silence that follows a true thing being said by someone who had the right to say it. Elias stood there for a long time. Then he walked to the house. Mara was in the garden when he came around the side of the house. She was staking the tomato plants, tying them to the small post she'd had Silas set last week, working her way along the row with a ball of string and a calm focus. She didn't look up when he came to the fence of the garden plot. He stood there until she finished the plant she was working on and moved to the next one. Silas talked to me, he said. She wound the string around the post. I assumed he might, she said. He has opinions. He's right, Elias said. She looked up then. I've been half in, he said. I told you I was afraid and I meant it, but telling you I was afraid wasn't the same as doing something about it. I've been waiting for the fear to go away, and I don't think it's going to go away. I think this is just what it feels like to actually be here, to be present in something. He looked at the garden, the beans and the squash and the tomatoes and the ragged little herbs she'd planted along the border, and then at her. I don't want to be half in anymore. She was looking at him with that seen-through look, the one that made half-truths collapse. What does all the way in look like, she said. Specifically. He came through the garden gate. He walked to where she was standing between the tomato stakes and the bean rows, and he took the ball of string out of her hand and set it on the post. And he took her face in both hands, both sides, left and right, without differentiation, without care for which side was which. And he kissed her. It was not the almost of the porch step. It was not tentative, and it was not careful, and it was not something he thought about or planned. It was the thing that comes after a very long time of knowing something is true, and finally, without ceremony or perfect timing, simply doing it. She went still for 1 second, the same stillness as the porch step, the breath-held quality. And then she was kissing him back, her hands coming up to his arms, and the garden was growing all around them in the late afternoon light, and the whole thing was imperfect and muddy-kneed and entirely real. When they broke apart, she was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not the almost smile or the managed neutrality or the careful calibration, just her, just Mara, unmanaged and present, looking at him from 12 inches away with her eyes slightly wide and her breath a little unsteady, and a tomato stake pressing into her shoulder blade that she didn't seem to notice. That, she said, is what all the way in looks like, he said. She let out a breath that might, in a different woman, have been a laugh. Then she reached back for the string and handed it to him. Then you can help with the rest of these stakes, she said. I don't know how you want them. I'll show you, she said. Watch. He watched. He helped. He did it wrong once, and she corrected him without drama, and he did it right after that. They worked to the end of the row in the warm evening air, and the garden held them both, and everything in it was growing. The week that followed was not a transformation. It was better than that. It was an accumulation, small things, honest things. He reached for her hand at the supper table and held it for a moment before letting go. She laughed at something he said, genuinely, the surprised kind, and didn't put it back in a box after. He told her one night, sitting on the porch in the dark, about the last week with Clara. The things he'd said and the things he'd failed to say, the particular weight of words left unspoken to someone who had then run out of time to hear them. He told it plainly, without self-pity, the way a person tells a thing when they've been carrying it long enough that it has become part of the weight they simply move with. She listened without filling the silences with reassurance. When he was done, she said, she knew, and he asked how she could know that, and she said, Because you're a man who has trouble saying it and she lived with you. She'd have learned to read what you meant. He hadn't thought of it that way before. It helped. It was on a Friday in late June that the letter came. Elias was in town for supplies, alone this run, because Mara was nursing a tomato blight she'd discovered on the south end of the garden and refused to leave unaddressed. And Pete Aldridge handed him his mail along with the flour and coffee, and there was a letter from a legal office in Billings that he opened standing at the counter. He read it once. Then he read it again. It was about a property dispute, specifically about the northern boundary of Mercer Ranch, a strip of land 40 feet wide that Gideon Voss was now formally claiming had been part of the original Voss land grant and had been incorrectly surveyed when Elias's deed was recorded. Elias folded the letter. He finished his errands in a particular quiet that Pete Aldridge noticed but did not ask about. He drove home steadily and found Mara in the garden on her knees with a bucket and a look of concentrated displeasure aimed at a row of tomato plants. "We have a problem," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. She read his face in that quick, efficient way she read everything, and she got up and came to the fence and took the letter he held out. She read it twice, the same way he had. "He's going after the land," she said. "Yes." "Because you called him a small man in front of witnesses," she said. Not a question. "That's my guess," he said. She looked at the letter. "Is the boundary dispute real?" "No," he said. "That land's been Mercer ground for 22 years. I have the survey records, but it doesn't matter if he's real or not. If he files it, I have to respond to it, and that means lawyers and time and money." She was quiet for a moment, turning the letter in her hands. "He came here and tried to pay me to leave," she said. "And when that didn't work, he waited 2 weeks and then did this." She looked up. "He's going to keep going." "Yes," Elias said. "He probably is." "Then we need to be smarter than him," she said. She handed the letter back. "Who's the best land lawyer in this county?" "Harlan Creek doesn't have." "Who's the best one within a day's ride?" she said. He thought. "There's a man in Fort Benton, Gerhard Holtz. He's expensive." "How expensive?" "More than I'd like." "How expensive compared to losing 40 feet of northern pasture to Gideon Voss?" she said. He looked at her. "We write to Holtz tomorrow," she said, "and we pull every survey record and deed document you have, and we get them organized before the meeting. Where do you keep them?" "The iron box in the back room," he said. "Under the—" "I'll find it," she said, and went back into the garden to finish what she'd been doing. He stood at the fence, watching her crouch back down over the tomato plants and resume her battle with the blight as if the Gideon Voss problem had been addressed and was now awaiting execution, and he felt something that was not romantic and not simple. It was the feeling of standing next to someone and knowing, without doubt, that they are going to fight the same fight you are fighting, for the same reasons, because the land is also theirs. It was the feeling of a partner. He had forgotten what that felt like. He had not been prepared for how much weight it could take off a man's shoulders. They spent that evening at the kitchen table with the iron box open and the documents spread out, and Mara going through them with a systematic thoroughness that made Silas, who'd come in to hear the news and stayed for supper, say at one point, "She's better organized than you are." "I'm aware," Elias said. "He keeps things chronologically but doesn't label them," Mara said without looking up. "So you have to read every document to know what it is instead of being able to find what you need quickly." "I always knew what they were," Elias said. "You won't always know what they are," she said, "particularly if something happens to you and someone else has to find them." Silas gave Elias a look that communicated, without words, that this was the sort of practical thinking that tended to be correct. They organized the documents. Mara made labels. She made a list of what needed to be in the letter to Holtz and read it aloud for Elias to correct or confirm, and he corrected one thing and confirmed the rest. And she wrote the letter that evening in her clear, plain hand, and he signed it. Later, after Silas had gone and the kitchen was cleaned up, and the iron box was relabeled and organized in a way that would make sense to anyone who opened it, they sat on the porch in the dark, the way they'd been sitting on the porch in the dark with increasing frequency. And the Montana night did what Montana nights did in June, spread itself out overhead with more stars than seemed strictly necessary, dense and cold and enormous. "He's not going to stop," Elias said. "Gideon. He's got more patience for a grudge than most people." "I know," she said. "It might get worse before it gets better." "Most things do," she said. He looked at her profile in the dark, the left side, the scarred side, which she no longer angled away from him. "Are you all right?" he said. "With all of it? With what we're walking into?" She thought about it genuinely, rather than reassuring him reflexively. "I've been walking into things my whole life," she said. "I've never had someone walking into it beside me." She was quiet for a moment. "That changes the calculation considerably." He took her hand. She let him, and then she turned hers over so their fingers were laced together rather than just held, which was a small thing and an entirely deliberate one. They sat there until the night got cold enough that going in made sense, and then they went in, and the house was warm and had people in it, and outside the garden was growing in the dark, the way growing things do. Steadily, invisibly, putting out roots in all directions toward whatever it can find to hold on to. Gideon Voss's letter sat on the table, addressed and ready to go to Fort Benton in the morning. And Elias Mercer, who had spent 3 years learning to need nothing and no one, went to sleep in a house that smelled like coffee and garden dirt and the particular clean smell of honest work, with the knowledge that tomorrow there would be a fight worth fighting and someone to fight it with. He slept well. He slept better than he had in a very long time. The letter to Gerhard Holtz went out on the Saturday morning stage, and then they waited. Waiting was its own kind of work. Elias knew this from ranching. There was the active labor of doing, and then there was the harder discipline of doing everything you could do and then holding steady while the rest unfolded at its own pace. The cattle didn't care about Gideon Voss's land claim. The fence line didn't care. The North Pasture water trough that had been leaking since April and finally gave out completely on a Tuesday didn't care about any of it, and so the days filled themselves the way days on a working ranch always did, with the particular democracy of physical necessity that makes no allowance for a man's internal weather. Mara finished the blue dress on a Wednesday evening in the first week of July. Elias was sitting at the kitchen table going over the pasture records when she came out of her room, their room now, a transition that had happened without ceremony sometime in the last weeks of June, another quiet fact that neither of them announced, wearing it. The blue was exactly what he'd thought it would be when he'd picked it in Pete Aldridge's store. It was the right color for her. He didn't say that in those words because he wasn't sure how to say it without sounding like he was making a speech. And she didn't need a speech. She needed an honest response. "It fits," he said. She looked at him with the patient expression of a woman who knows she is getting the abbreviated version of something. "That's all?" "It's a good blue," he said. "It suits you." She looked down at the dress, smoothed the skirt once with both hands. "The left seam is slightly off," she said. "I'll fix it." "I can't see anything wrong with it." "That's because you're not looking," she said, but not unkindly. She went back to the room to change, and he sat at the kitchen table and thought about the color blue, and about what it meant that she'd made herself something beautiful, something that was hers alone, in this house, with fabric he'd chosen because he'd wanted to, and for no other reason. It meant she was staying, not just because she'd put the bag down, not just because of the letter to Holtz or the organized documents in the iron box. She was staying the way a person stays when they have begun, cautiously and with full knowledge of the risk, to believe that the place is actually theirs. He went back to the pasture records and did not say any of this out loud because she already knew it, and saying it would only make her self-conscious about the seam. Holtz's reply came 12 days after they'd sent the letter. It was precise and businesslike, and it told them what they needed to know. The survey records they had were solid, the original deed was clean, and Gideon Voss's claim rested on a piece of documentation that Holtz described, in the careful language of a professional man, as of questionable provenance. He would handle the response to Voss's lawyers, and he expected the matter to be resolved before it reached any formal proceeding, provided the Mercer records were as clear as described. His fee was stated plainly at the bottom of the letter. Mara read it twice and then set it down and said, "He's confident." "He's been doing this for 30 years, Elias said. "He's also expensive," she said. "Yes." "Worth it," she said, which was the same thing she'd said when he'd first mentioned Holtz's name, and he appreciated the consistency of it. They sent the survey records to Fort Benton with the next stage and waited again. It was during this second round of waiting that Harlan Creek began its own slow adjustment to the reality of Mara Mercer. It didn't happen in a single moment or because of any single thing. It happened the way most genuine changes happen in small communities. through accumulation, through the patient pressure of consistent presence, through the simple fact of a person continuing to be there and be themselves until the community runs out of reasons to pretend otherwise. Mara went to town regularly now. She drove herself more often than not, and she did not wear the veil. The first few times she'd done this, walked into Pete Aldridge's store or the post office without the veil, with the left side of her face in full view of anyone who looked, she'd felt the particular public exposure of it like a thin, cold draft. People looked. Some people always would, but she had been managing people who looked since she was 23 years old, and she had made a private decision sometime in June that she was not going to let Harlan Creek have the veil as a concession. She had not made a speech about it to Elias or to Silas. She had simply stopped wearing it to town, and that was that. What happened gradually was this: the looking became less. Not because people stopped being curious, but because familiarity has a flattening effect on curiosity, and Mara was simply in Harlan Creek too consistently to remain a novelty. She knew Pete Aldridge's ordering schedule. She knew which mornings the post office was busy and which ones it wasn't. She had helped Martha Henley, the seamstress, with a particularly complicated alteration problem. One afternoon when she'd been in the shop for thread, and Martha had been struggling, and Martha had looked at her hands working the fabric with an expression that shifted from surprise to respect over the course of about 10 minutes. Martha had not become her friend exactly, but she had begun saying good morning first, which was its own kind of progress. The woman who did become something close to a friend was Agnes Price, the wife of Callum Price, who'd been standing with Gideon Voss the day of that first terrible encounter on the boardwalk. Agnes was a sharp-tongued, practical woman in her 50s who had clearly spent 3 decades being married to a man who followed Gideon Voss's lead and had developed as a survival mechanism a very good eye for other people's situations. She had stopped Mara outside the post office one morning in late July and said, without preamble, "I owe you an apology on behalf of my husband. He stood there that first day and said nothing, and he should have." Mara had looked at her steadily. "He didn't say anything either way," she said. "Silence isn't neutral," Agnes said. "I've told him that. He doesn't listen, but I've told him." She looked at Mara with the frank appraisal of a woman who has learned not to waste time. "You've done something real out at that ranch. I can see it from the road. The place was falling apart." "It needed work," Mara said. "Everything worth keeping does," Agnes said, and then asked her opinion on whether the feed store's new oats were worth the price, and they had talked for 20 minutes standing outside the post office, and that was that. Elias heard about Agnes Price secondhand from Silas, who had heard it from the man who ran the feed store. He mentioned it to Mara at supper, and she shrugged and said, "She's practical," as if that settled the matter of character entirely. He supposed for Mara, it probably did. The land dispute was resolved on a Thursday in the second week of August. Holt sent a letter that was 3 sentences long. The claim had been withdrawn. Voss's lawyers had, upon review of the Mercer survey records, advised their client that the case would not hold. There was no formal proceeding. There was no dramatic confrontation. The whole thing simply collapsed because it had been built on sand and a man's wounded pride, and neither of those is adequate foundation for anything that needs to last. Elias read the letter at the kitchen table. He set it down. He thought about 3 sentences representing the end of something that had cost him 2 months of low-grade anxiety and a lawyer's fee that had made him wince. "It's over," he said. Mara was at the stove. She turned. He held up the letter. She crossed the kitchen and read it standing beside him, and when she finished, she let out a long breath through her nose and set the letter back on the table. "He'll find something else eventually," she said. "Maybe," Elias said, "or maybe he'll decide it's not worth his time." "Men like Gideon Voss always think it's worth their time," she said, "but the land's safe. That's what matters now." It was. The land was safe, and the house was solid, and the garden had produced beyond what either of them had projected, which was partly good planning and partly the particular generosity of a Montana summer when the weather decides to cooperate. The beans had come in so heavily that Mara had spent a week preserving them, filling jars that now lined the storeroom shelf in satisfying rows. The squash had done well in its chosen location. The tomatoes, blight and all, had rallied in the back half of the season and come in strong, and the herbs along the border, which had seemed optimistic in May, had turned into something that made the kitchen smell different, better, like a kitchen where someone had been cooking seriously for years. Silas had taken to eating supper with them 3 nights a week rather than 2, which was not something anyone had formally arranged but had arrived naturally, and nobody had seen any reason to interfere with it. On a Saturday evening in late August, Elias came in from the barn to find the kitchen warm and full of the smell of something good on the stove, and Mara at the table with a piece of paper and her pencil, making another list. He recognized this particular posture, the focused lean, the pencil moving in small deliberate marks, as the posture of a woman planning something. "What is it this time?" he said. He poured himself water from the pitcher and came to look over her shoulder. "More garden?" "Bigger garden," she said. "And I want chickens." He looked at the paper. She had sketched a rough outline of the current garden plot and an expanded version beside it, with a separate area labeled in her plain, clear hand, "Poultry." "Chickens," he said. "For eggs," she said, "and eventually meat, but primarily eggs. We're buying eggs in town every 2 weeks. That's money we don't need to spend." "Where would we keep them?" "The small outbuilding behind the barn is just storing old equipment," she said. "Silas said half of it could go. We clean it out, build some nest boxes along the back wall, put up a proper run on the south side." "You've talked to Silas about this?" "I needed to know about the outbuilding before I could plan the run," she said, as if this were perfectly obvious. "He's in favor. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that fresh eggs were long overdue." Elias looked at the sketch. He looked at the list, which included not only the infrastructure requirements, but a preliminary count of birds and an estimated timeline for when they'd begin producing. He looked at his wife. This word had stopped feeling large and foreign in his mouth. It now fit the way well-worn things fit, comfortably and without drawing attention to itself. And he thought about January. He thought about a woman stepping off a stage in a veil, offering to leave before anything started. He thought about an empty house and curtainless windows and a kitchen that smelled like nothing. "How many chickens?" he said. 12 to start," she said. "We can expand from there." "All right," he said. She looked up. "All right?" "All right," he said again. 12 chickens. We'll start on the outbuilding next week." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he had come to recognize as the one she wore when things went differently than she'd prepared for. When the resistance she'd braced against didn't materialize and she had to reorient quickly. It was becoming less frequent. He was glad of that. "Good," she said, and went back to her list. He sat down across from her and drank his water and watched her plan, and outside the Montana evening settled over the ranch in the long golden way of late summer, and the garden was out there in the last of the light, and the whole thing was ordinary and was not ordinary at all. It was Silas who pointed out one morning in September while they were working on the outbuilding that the ranch looked different than it had in years. "Different how?" Elias said. "I was pulling boards off the south wall to check them for rot, which was satisfying work, the kind where the problem is visible and the solution is clear and you can see the progress." "Alive," Silas said. He was cleaning out the back corner, moving old equipment with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has spent 60 years doing physical work and has long since stopped rushing any of it. It looked like a place someone used to live. Now it looks like a place someone lives. Elias considered this. "She did that," Silas said. "But you let her. That matters too." "I almost didn't," Elias said. "I know," Silas said. "I watched you almost not." He moved a rusted hand plow to the side. "You came around." "Eventually." "Eventually is better than never," Silas said. "I've seen men who never came around. It's a sad thing to watch." He examined the hand plow with the expression of a man deciding whether it was worth keeping. It wasn't, visibly. He put it in the discard pile anyway and kept moving. Elias pulled another board and checked it. Sound. He set it aside to reuse. "I was afraid," he said. Not confessing it, just stating it, the way he'd been learning to state things plainly since the morning in the kitchen, when Mara had stood in the doorway with her bag, and he'd had to choose between the truth and the easier thing. "I know you were," Silas said, "of losing someone again." "I know what you were afraid of," Silas said. Not unkind. Just, he knew. He'd been there for all of it. He didn't need the inventory. "She didn't make it easier to be afraid," Elias said. She kept being worth it, even when I was making it difficult." Silas looked at him. That's the right woman, he said. When they're worth it, even when you're being an idiot. That's the one. They worked in silence for a while, pulling boards and sorting them and building a discard pile that grew into something impressive. The outbuilding was in better shape than it had looked from outside. What? Good bones, bad neglect, which was a situation Elias had some experience with recognizing and working with. Mara appeared at 11 with coffee and a clear sense of how the nest boxes should be positioned that she'd apparently been refining in her head since the conversation about chickens, and which she delivered to Silas while Elias stood to the side, drinking his coffee and watching the two of them debate the merits of south-facing versus east-facing boxes with the seriousness of people discussing something that genuinely mattered. Silas said east. Mara said south. They argued it for 4 minutes, and Mara produced from her apron pocket a hand-drawn diagram that settled the matter in her favor, and Silas looked at the diagram and said, "All right, South," with the tone of a man who was not entirely conceding the point, but recognizing an argument he wasn't going to win. The chickens arrived the second week of October, 12 of them in a crate that made the wagon smell like a barn for 2 days afterward. Mara had done her research. She knew their breeds, their laying patterns, their particular quirks, and she spent the first evening introducing herself to each of them with a seriousness that Elias watched from the gate of the new run with something warm moving around in his chest that he had stopped pretending wasn't love some time ago. "You're talking to them," he said. "They need to know the sound of the people who feed them," she said. She was crouching down to eye level with a red hen who was looking at her with the expression of a creature that has not yet decided whether to trust this situation. "It makes them calmer." "Does it work?" "Ask me in 2 weeks," she said. In 2 weeks, the chickens were settled, and the red hen in particular had developed a habit of following Mara to the gate of the run every morning, with an attentiveness that suggested the talking had worked, or at least that the red hen had made a pragmatic decision about who controlled the feed. They started getting eggs in November, which Mara recorded in a small notebook with the date and the count and a running total, because she was Mara, and that was what she did with information. Gideon Voss came to the ranch in November. Not with a legal claim this time, and not with an offer of money. He came alone, on a Tuesday morning when the first real snow of the season was sitting lightly on the ground, and he knocked on the front door with his hat in his hand. Elias answered it. He looked at Gideon Voss standing on his porch, with his hat in his hands for a long moment, and said nothing. "I'd like to speak with you," Gideon said. His voice had a quality Elias had never heard in it before. Not humble exactly. Gideon Voss was structurally incapable of humble, but something that had been worn down by something that had less air in it than usual. "You can speak," Elias said. He did not open the door wider, did not invite him in. Gideon looked at his hat. "The land thing was wrong," he said. "What I did, the claim." He paused. "My lawyer told me the records were solid, and I pushed him to file anyway because I was—" Another pause. "Because I was angry, and I was wrong to do it." Elias looked at him. "And what I said to your wife," Gideon said, "in town that first day. And what I said when I came here." He looked up. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was holding something tight. "She didn't deserve that." The porch was cold. The snow was coming down in small, fine flakes that weren't accumulating yet. Elias thought about Mara standing on a boardwalk with her chin level and her hands still, while this man's voice landed on her like a stone. He thought about damaged inventory said loud enough for everyone to hear. "No," he said. "She didn't." Gideon held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to." He stopped, started again. "I know I'm not owed anything. I'm just telling you it was wrong." Elias stood in his doorway and thought about what kind of man he was going to be in this moment. Not the kind of moment that gets decided dramatically, in a rush of feeling, the kind that gets decided in about 4 seconds of quiet, while the snow comes down and another man waits to hear what you're going to say. "You can tell her that yourself," Elias said. "If you mean it." Gideon blinked. She's in the kitchen," Elias said. He opened the door. Gideon Voss came into the house of the woman he had tried twice to remove from it, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and Mara turned from the stove and looked at him with an expression that was entirely unreadable. "Mrs. Mercer," Gideon said. "Mr. Voss," she said. "I owe you an apology," he said. What I said both times. It was wrong. He seemed to be working through something difficult. I'm sorry for it. The kitchen was quiet. Mara looked at him for a moment with that seen-through look that Elias had come to understand meant she was measuring something. Not the words, but the thing underneath the words. The thing that determined whether they were real or just correctly shaped noise. Then she said, "Sit down, Mr. Voss. I'll get you coffee." Gideon sat. He looked slightly stunned. Elias sat across from him, and Mara put coffee in front of both of them and sat at the end of the table. And they had a conversation that was not comfortable and was not warm but was honest, which was more than it might have been. Gideon drank his coffee and said what he'd come to say and did not dress it up with more than it was. And Mara listened and said what she thought, which included telling him plainly that the words he'd said were the kind that didn't simply disappear because someone later regretted them. He said he understood. She said she hoped he did. He left after 30 minutes. He shook Elias's hand at the door, which they both treated as the slightly awkward thing it was, and he put his hat on and walked to his horse and rode out, and the snow came down lightly behind him and closed over the prints his boots had made on the porch. Elias shut the door. He turned around. Mara was back at the stove. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "That was unexpected," she said. "Yes." She stirred whatever was in the pot. "I don't trust it completely." "No," he said. "I don't either." "But it wasn't nothing," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't nothing." She nodded, once, with the practical finality she applied to things she'd assessed and placed in their appropriate category. Gideon Voss's apology was now in whatever category that was. She would not waste energy relitigating it. She was done. He came to stand behind her, and he put his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned back into it slightly. The same barely perceptible lean as the porch step in spring, but comfortable now, habitual. A thing that happened without either of them deciding to do it. "The soup's almost ready," she said. "It smells good," he said. "It's just the leftover bean soup," she said. "Don't build it into something." "I'm not building anything," he said. "It smells good." She looked at him over her shoulder. The almost smile had, over the months, graduated into a real one that appeared regularly enough that he'd stopped cataloging each occurrence and simply lived inside the fact of it. "Get the bowls," she said. He got the bowls. December came in hard, which was standard. The cattle needed more attention in the cold, and the chickens required a lamp in the coop on the worst nights, which Mara had planned for with a foresight that made Silas say, "She thought of that before I did," with genuine admiration. The garden was under snow and would stay there until March, but Mara had drawn the plans for next year's expansion already. The paper pinned inside the back door beside the planting schedule from this year, next year's version larger and more ambitious, with a note that said, "Beets. Try the south corner" in small letters at the bottom that she'd added one evening and not mentioned. He saw it one morning and said nothing, but he stood there looking at it for a long time. At the careful pencil marks and the patient planning of a woman who was thinking about next spring. About the spring after that. About the south corner in years to come. She was planting herself here, in the most literal and the most profound sense. She was putting down roots in the same dirt she'd been willing to walk away from in May, and she was doing it not because she had no other option, but because she had chosen this ranch, this man, this life, with the full knowledge of what it had cost her to get here and what it would cost her to stay. He thought about the letter she'd written in May. "I'm sorry I wasn't what you needed." He thought about what it took to write that sentence. What kind of long practice and disappointment produces a person who apologizes, on their way out the door, for not being sufficient. He thought about the south corner with its planned beets. He went to find her. She was in the chicken coop, checking on the lamp, crouching down in the cold with her breath-making clouds, and the red hen watching her from the far corner with that particular attentive quality. "Next year's plan has beets in the south corner," he said. She looked up. "The soil's right for it there," she said. "Good drainage." "I was thinking," he said, "that we should expand the whole south fence, not just the garden. Take in another 30 feet and make the garden large enough that you could sell some of what you grow, at the market in town, or direct to people. There's demand for good vegetables." She sat back on her heels. She looked at him. "That's a significant expansion," she said. "I know. We'd need to break new ground." "Yes. That's a lot of work in the spring." "I'm aware," he said. "I'm asking if you want to do it." She looked at the hen, She looked at the lamp casting its warmth across the coop. She looked at him, and her expression did something he'd seen more lately. Something open and unmanaged. Something that was just her face feeling what it felt without the overlay of careful navigation. "Yes," she said. "I want to do it." "Good," he said. "I'll talk to Silas." She stood up and dusted straw off her knees, and they walked back to the house through the cold, with the snow under their boots, and the morning light flat and white on the land. And Mercer Ranch lay around them in every direction. The barn and the coop and the outbuilding with its nest boxes and the big house with its curtained windows and its reorganized shelves and its iron box of labeled documents and its marriage license on the kitchen wall where Mara had hung it one afternoon without announcement. He had come in to find it there and looked at it and looked at her, and she had said, "It should be where people can see it." And he had said, "All right." And that had been that. It was where people could see it. Where they could see it. Later that winter, on an evening when the snow was coming down seriously, and the stove was full and Silas had eaten with them and gone back to the bunkhouse, and the chickens were warm in their coop, and the soup had been good, and the kitchen was the kind of warm that makes everything outside the window feel very far away. Mara sat across from Elias at the kitchen table with her coffee and said, "I've been thinking." "About beets," he said. "Not about beets," she said. About whether we have room." She looked at the coffee cup, looked at him. "In the house. Whether we have room." He looked at her. "There are 2 bedrooms," she said, "and the storeroom is large enough that if someone took it apart and rebuilt it, it would make a 3rd. She was being very careful with her words, not performing anything, just saying the thing plainly the way she said everything. "That's a significant project. I'm just thinking about whether it's a project worth doing." He understood what she was asking, not as a question about woodwork or room dimensions. As the question underneath the question, whether this life they'd built was one they intended to fill. Whether the ranch they were expanding and the ground they were breaking and the south corner with its planned beets was the beginning of something or the whole of it. He thought about what he wanted to say, and then he said it without editing it first. "It's worth doing," he said. "I think it's worth doing." She nodded. She drank her coffee. Her face was doing the unmanaged thing, the open thing, and there was something in it that he recognized because he'd been watching her face for nearly a year and had learned to read its weather. Something that was not quite relief and not quite happiness, but was close to both. The feeling of a person who has arrived somewhere they were not sure they were going to be allowed to stay. She had stayed. She was staying. She was planning beets and arguing with Silas about nest boxes and driving herself to town without the veil and making lists with her plain pencil and her clear hand. And she was, in every way that mattered, home. Not because the ranch was perfect. The south fence still needed work every spring. The window in the washroom let in cold air despite 2 rounds of caulking. The red hen was an eccentric creature who had once escaped the run and made it halfway to the house before Mara caught her. And the whole episode had cost Elias his composure twice. The summer ahead would be hard work, and the winter after that would be long, and there would be mornings when they were short with each other over small things, and evenings when the weight of the running of a ranch pressed down on both of them in ways that were not romantic and not simple. None of that was going to stop. But here was the thing Elias had learned, slowly and at some personal cost, over the course of a year that had required more honesty from him than any 3 years previous. A life doesn't become real when the hard parts stop. It becomes real when 2 people decide, together and repeatedly, and on the ordinary days as much as the significant ones, to keep showing up for it. He had almost not shown up. He had come very close, standing at kitchen windows, lying awake in the dark, performing caution as if caution were the same as wisdom, to letting the best thing that had happened to him since Clara walk out the door with a note on the table that said, "I'm sorry I wasn't what you needed." She had been exactly what he needed. She had been precisely, specifically, irreplaceably what he needed, which was not a woman without complications or a life without difficulty, but a person who would stand in the same ground with him and refuse to leave when it got hard. He had needed to become someone who would do the same. He wasn't certain he'd managed it fully yet. He suspected it was the work of years rather than months. But he was trying, genuinely, imperfectly, on the ordinary days and the difficult ones. And that trying was something Mara could see. She'd told him so, in her plain, direct way. "I can see you trying," she'd said, on a night in October when they'd had a disagreement about something that didn't matter, and he'd come back to it rather than letting it sit unaddressed. That's not nothing. It should be more than not nothing, he'd said. It's a start, she'd said. Starts are what you build from. She knew about building from starts. She was an authority on it. The snow came down outside, and the lamp was warm, and the kitchen smelled like coffee, and the remnants of supper, and faintly like the herbs she'd dried and hung from the ceiling beam in October. And on the wall the marriage license hung in its frame where people could see it. He looked at his wife across the table. She looked at him. The storeroom, he said. I'll talk to Silas about what it would take. In the spring. After the fence. After the fence, she agreed. And the beets. The beets go in first, she said. The timing matters. Of course it does, he said. She looked at him with the real smile, the full one, the one that had been coming more easily as the year turned and the distance between them closed and the house filled up with the accumulated weight of shared life. He still held on to it when it appeared. Probably always would. Some things a man catalogs without meaning to, stores up against the cold. Outside, the Montana winter did what it always did. Pressed down, relentless, from all directions at once. The land was deep under snow and the fence lines were white and the garden was invisible beneath it, all that careful planting resting and waiting for the ground to turn. But in the spring it would come up. Everything she'd put in the ground would come up. That was the thing about planting. You had to believe in what you couldn't yet see. You had to put the seed in the dark ground and do the work and wait and trust that what you'd planted was real, that the roots were taking hold down where you couldn't watch them, that the cold was not the end of the story, but only the season between one growing thing and the next. Elias Mercer had spent 3 years believing that the cold was the whole of it, that grief was a permanent climate rather than a hard winter, that a man who'd lost enough had the right to stop planting anything. He'd been wrong about that. He knew it now, sitting in a warm kitchen in December with a woman who'd driven a spade into frozen ground and refused to stop until it gave way. You had to keep planting. You had to believe the ground would hold what you put into it. You had to be willing, in the end, to stay.